I think that last year we covered the beginning of Parshas Tetzei. So today we'll start somewhere in the middle and even towards the end. So if you can, open up to Sefer Dvarim Perek Chav Gimel, and let's take a look at a very small unit of psukim, actually two in number, and they begin with Pasuk Tezayin. Lo tasgir eved el Adonai, which means that you do not return a slave to its master if the slave ran away. And the Gemara Gittin on Daf Mem Hey tells us that this is a reference to an Eved who ran away from Bavel or anywhere in Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. What this means is that if we define the essence of Avdus, of what it means to be a slave, then this Eved who ran to Eretz Yisrael and aspired to be inspired by the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, he is the antithesis of an Eved, and therefore he gains his freedom. What is Avdus, and why is Eretz Yisrael and sanctity the opposite, the antithetical to what it means to be an Eved? An Eved is someone who cannot really differentiate between that which is Kodesh and that which is Chol. The concept of profane and sanctified is something that he doesn't really grasp. And that's why an Eved is considered cut off from the products of his own labor. Anything that he produces automatically accrues to his master. However, when a slave has a deep aspiration to be part of the Jewish people, and he wants to undergo a full-fledged gerus, in which he accepts upon himself 613 mitzvahs, for such a person, we can say that his desire of sanctity puts him into a new category. And that category, as the Pasuk says, is Li B'nai Yisrael Avodim. My people are my servants, says God. They are not servants to human beings. And therefore, if a slave runs away to Eretz Yisrael, it means he wants to immerse himself and profoundly connect himself to the sanctity of the Jewish people as it reflects itself and manifests itself in Eretz Yisrael. Such an Eved is worthy of being a full-fledged Jew, of making that transition from Avdus to being a Ben Chorin. He's Kili B'nai Yisrael Avodim. He wants to be an Eved to Hashem. His aspirations, his longings are to be close to Hashem. That's the opposite of a slave. A slave accepts upon himself a human master. He doesn't want Kili B'nai Yisrael Avodim. He doesn't want to be an Eved to Hashem. That's the essence of Avdus. And if this Eved, in particular, decides to cut himself off from that dimension of Avdus, he wants to, with a higher aspiration, be close to Hashem, he wants to be close to sanctity, then we have to let him free. Because the essence of Avdus is the profane, which is the opposite of that which is sanctified. Sanctity, Kedusha, and Avdus are mutually exclusive. They are absolutely antithetical one to the other. A slave is someone who's unworthy. He's impure. He is profane. And he doesn't size up to the sanctity and to the spiritual holiness of a Jewish personality. And that's why a slave who is immersed in his defective personality, in which he's totally dependent upon someone else, a human being, a master, a human master, therefore he is excluded from testimony. We don't trust his testimony. He doesn't see reality in the clear way. He sees it through the eyes of his master. Likewise, he cannot marry a Jewish girl. He doesn't have the ability to rise up to that level of a sanctified, holy life of Kiddushin. And therefore, he cannot be part of a marriage contract in Jewish law. But now, when this moment came about and the Eved achieved his own personal sanctity, now he's ready to be free and to embrace all of the sanctity of Klal Yisrael as it expresses itself in 613 mitzvahs. And now we understand, if an Eved decides to undergo gerus, he's not happy, he's not content with his status as is, as an Eved. He desires, he has aspirations to go beyond that, to embrace the entire Torah, all 613 mitzvahs, and become a complete ger. Then we have to free him. He's no longer an Eved. I'd like to call your attention to the very next pasuk. So for those who joined a little bit late, we are in Perek Chaf Gimel 23 of Sefer Dvarim, and now we're looking at pasuk Yud Ches, verse 18. Lo tia kedesha mibnos Yisrael, v'lo yiyeh kadesh mibnei Yisrael. First, I'll read the English translation. There shall not be a prostitute amongst the daughters of Israel. There shall not be a male prostitute amongst the sons of Israel. And we want to take a look for a moment at Onkelos, the Targum. He writes that Lo tehei isisa mibnas Yisrael ligvar avad, that a daughter of Israel should not marry an Eved. V'lo yisav gavra mibnei Yisrael isisa oma, nor will a Jewish man marry a non-Jewish maidservant. And basically, what we have here is a double prohibition. One prohibition is on a Bas Yisrael, that she should not marry an Eved. And then the Torah went out of its way to add another prohibition that addresses a Jewish man and enjoins him from marrying a maidservant, a shifcha. And it would seem from Onkelos that both of these prohibitions are equal. They're two sides of a coin. She can't marry an Eved, and he can't marry a shifcha. But the question is, if the Torah already prohibited a Jewish man from marrying a shifcha, a Canaanite slave, maidservant, then why did the Torah feel necessary to add a prohibition on a Jewish woman enjoining her from marrying an Eved? It would seem from Onkelos, both of these Isurim are one and the same. Why did the Torah have to spell out that a Jewish woman cannot marry an Eved? But I believe that there's a very fundamental answer to this question. It's both halachic and hashkafic at the same time. When a Jewish man marries a shivcha, a non-Jewish shivcha from Bnos Canaan, the child of that relationship is not Jewish. But if a Jewish woman marries an Eved Kanaani, the child is Jewish. We might have suspected that although a Jewish man is enjoined from marrying a shivcha, the same issur doesn't apply in the flip case with regard to a Jewish woman marrying an Eved. And therefore, the Torah had to go out of its way to tell us that this relationship is unacceptable, irrelevant to the status of the child as a result of the marriage. So that even though obviously there's more room to be strict in the case of a Jewish man, because when he marries a shivcha, his zera, his children are no longer Jewish. They cannot be Jewish unless they undergo gerus. But they're not born Jewish, whereas a Jewish woman who has a relationship with an Eved Knani, the child is Jewish. But despite that, the Torah came to tell us that this relationship between a Bas Yisrael, who is sanctified, with Kedushas Yisrael, is enjoined from marrying an Eved. I would like to fast forward a bit here in Perek Chav Gimel and take a look at Pasuk Chav Dalet. This pasuk is part of a series, a unit of psukim that begins with pasuk Chav Beis and ends with pasuk Chav Dalet. But I want to focus our attention tonight on the last pasuk in this unit, namely pasuk Chav Dalet. Motzos vasecha tishmar v'asisa kasher nadart. The pasuk warns us about our commitments that we took in a verbal declaration, in an oath or a pledge. And the Torah says, observe that which you emitted from your lips, just as you have pledged to the Lord your God. And this, of course, touches on the human power of speech, the great endowment of a human being, the power of speech. In contemporary life, we often encounter the following type of use of speech. You have a lecturer who is very eloquent. He knows, he has command of language. He can impress his audience. You can have theologians and university professors, demagogues, and with that eloquence in speech, they impress their audiences, but it's really just what we call minasafa ulachutz. It's really just superficial. There's nothing profound that comes from their heart. And this is not a modern phenomenon. People think, oh, that's in contemporary life. You have the skill of rhetoric, but it really dates back all the way to ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks were experts. They had a pleasant voice, a golden tongue, and an amazing, uncanny talent and ability, the power of speech. And today we see it again and again. The greatest statesmen and the most popular politicians are people who have control over their audiences because of their great endowment and talent and the power of speech. And even amongst rabbis, we see this. Rabbis that are successful because of their skills and their ability to reach out to the masses with eloquent speech. However, Shlomo HaMelech in Mishlei tells us something very important. And it sheds a whole new light on the power of speech. And in this pasuk in Perek Zion of Sefer Mishlei, which is a pasuk that we repeat over and over again during the Yomim Noraim Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Shlomo HaMelech points out that there's a difference between man's heart and his tongue. Man is in control of his heart, but he's not necessarily in control of his tongue. And mana lashon, the answer of the tongue, is me Hashem. It comes from God. What is Shlomo HaMelech trying to transmit to us when he contrasts the heart, which is really man, as opposed to the tongue? Shlomo HaMelech wants to differentiate between two types of use of the tongue. One is a true, genuine expression of what's in his heart. It is words that flow from the heart. And Shlomo HaMelech wants to impress us that there's got to be a connection. I would almost call it a bond between the heart and the tongue. Otherwise, words are just, as we said before, words of eloquence, of beautiful speech, but they're devoid of any genuine emotion, any genuine feeling. They don't come from the heart. It's flowery language. It's meant to impress the audiences who, more often than not, don't even understand that language. Crowds of people. And they can create hysteria. People listen, and the lecturer yells, roars, and impresses them. But talk is cheap. It's superficial. He's exploiting a gift of rhetoric that really comes from God, but it's not his. Because Shlomo HaMelech says that speech that is genuine yours is speech that comes from the heart, not just from the tongue. And this, I think, is the underlying message, the secret message of Motzos Vasecha Tishma. Be careful about your tongue. Don't misuse it. Don't cut it off from your heart, but rather your dibur peh should always be an expression and a manifestation of your genuine feelings that emanate from your heart. I'd like to talk to you about a sensitive topic, and it's a little bit hard for me to discuss this topic, but the Torah addresses the possibility of a marriage that can be terminated. We don't believe in Catholic marriage. And it's right here at the beginning of Perek Chaf Daled of Sefer Dvarim, in the latter part of Parshas Tetzei, our parsha. And I'll come back to Shoftim in Mirz Hashem a little bit later. I want to get it just to jump ahead of myself for Parshas Tetzei. The Torah says, Ki kach ish isha ubala, v'haya im lo timtza chen b'einav, etc. And then the Torah prescribes the legal step-by-step process of gerush, of divorce. And here we have a fundamental machlokes as to how to understand the background for gerush. And the issue that's being addressed here is, under what circumstances does the Torah encourage a person to divorce his wife? Beit Shammai take the pasuk literally. Let's read the pasuk again. The pasuk says, "Ki matza ba ervas dava," and Beit Shammai say the following: that a man should not divorce his wife unless he found her guilty of adultery. Ki matza ba ervas dava. He discovers in her this immorality. And Beis Hill says, no, the Torah allows a man to divorce his wife even if she spoils his food. And Rabbi Akiva says, even if he found another woman who's more attractive than his wife, that too comes under this pasuk that lo timtza chen b'einav, the Torah says. She does not find favor in his eyes. Beit Shammai is addressing a scenario in which Bezdin were not able, they didn't have enough evidence to establish that this woman had indeed committed adultery. But yet, her husband may know the truth. Cannot be proved in a court of law. So the concept of ki motza ba'ervas dava, really, in a legal sense, is something that has to be judged by the judges in a court. However, he may not have legal or formal rights to divorce his wife because there was no, as we said before, complete, reliable evidence to establish a definite termination of the marriage because of an act of adultery. But Beit Shammai says that if he has reason to believe he may have found her in a compromising position, there were no witnesses, he will divorce his wife. What is Rabbi Akiva's approach? Rabbi Akiva says, Ervas Davar, don't interpret Ervas Davar literally, the way Beit Shammai would have it. Ervas Davar is immorality. It doesn't have to mean adultery. What is the connection between immorality, the way Rabbi Akiva defines it, and a case of a man, lo timtza chen b'einav, who finds another woman more attractive than his own wife? And I believe the answer is a very profound answer. A man who finds another woman more attractive than his own wife, if he has a desire for a different woman other than his wife, that itself makes him into someone who's involved in an adulterous relationship. He, in a certain moral sense, not legally, of course, is committing adultery. He's already imagining himself with another woman other than his wife. He has what I would call sinful wishes, desires that border on adultery. And as opposed to Beit Shammai, who put the emphasis on her act of adultery, Beis Hillel put the emphasis, and Rabbi Akiva put the emphasis on his adultery. This is not a legal aspect of marriage and divorce, but this is relative to the sanctity of Jewish marriage, the kedusha of the bris and the covenant between a husband and a wife. And if he is somewhat estranged from his mate, from his wife, because she no longer attracts him, he doesn't cherish her companionship anymore, then the marriage, in effect, has already begun to dissolve. And all that's necessary now is simply to implement the legal dimension and the process of gerushin, a formal conclusion of divorce. But the process of divorce has really been set in motion long before the actual divorce. So much for Parshas Tetzei. And now we go back for a moment to Parshas Shoftim. Shoftim deals with the more, can we call it, legalistic aspects of court procedure, and the requirements of judges. The Torah establishes that we have a requirement to establish judges in all our cities. And the Torah says, tzedek, tzedek tirdov. And this is in Perek Tes Vav, Pasuk Chav. Now, above and beyond the question of why the Torah repeats the word tzedek twice, and the translation reads, justice, justice shall you pursue. And then it says, Laman tichya, so that you may live. And the question that I want to raise here is, what is the connection between this double aspect of tzedek and living? Let me focus your attention for a moment on the mitzvah of tzedakah, which, from an etymological perspective, the root of the word tzedakah is tzedek. What is the Jewish attitude towards the relationship between tzedek and tzedakah? It cannot be coincidental that they are both the same word, and that tzedakah is just another form of tzedek. And at the face of it, these two concepts of tzedek and tzedakah are mutually exclusive, almost antithetical, because whereas tzedek means justice, meaning giving a person what's rightfully his, tzedakah is just the opposite. I don't owe this destitute person anything. He doesn't have any legal claim for justice. What does it mean that tzedakah is called tzedek? And the Torah goes out of its way to repeat the word tzedek twice, and leman tif. I believe the answer will change our whole attitude towards tzedakah. The Torah declares, ki li kol haaretz, the entire earth belongs to God. The Gemara tells us in Masechet Brachos that before a person recites the bracha, and if he wants to benefit from this world, enjoy an apple or an orange, whatever he likes, and he doesn't make a bracha, he is violating the Isser, the prohibition of gzela, of stealing. It's my apple. All right, I didn't make a bracha. Why am I stealing? Who am I stealing it from? But the answer is, ki li kol haaretz, because God is the master and the owner of the entire world. And any possession that you have, in truth, was given to you through divine grace. And God says, you know what? Something is not working properly. For whatever reason, the money and the eminence from God of possessions is not being divvied up in the proper way. And Reuven has excess funds. Shimon doesn't have enough money to put food on his table. There's something awry in the system. And the Torah commands us in the mitzvah of tzedakah, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins that a person is obligated in the mitzvah of tzedakah, and if he refuses to live up to the obligation, the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Tzedakah, Matnas Aniyim, in Yoredea, right, in the Don, that we can force the person by confiscating his property. Why? This is my hard-earned possession. I have money in the bank. I earned it. Kidasu kidin. I didn't steal it from anyone. Why are you taking it away? Why are you confiscating it? And the answer is, on a halachic level, the mitzvah of tzedakah is a chovas mammon. It's no different than borrowing money from someone else. And if you don't return that money, Beis Din will confiscate your property. Tzedakah is tzedek. And it means that the ani, from a Jewish perspective, has a right to demand tzedakah. It's an amazing concept. And Beis Din will enforce the fulfillment of the mitzvah of tzedakah, just like they will force and compel a person to pay up his debts. And on a hashkafic level, it means that this is replacing justice in the world. It's not coincidental that tzedakah is milashon tzedek. And here I want to tell you that I believe that the Jewish nation, over the course of time, by and large, have achieved this mitzvah in a very unique way. Both justice in terms of the courts, and more important, tzedakah in terms of support for the needy. And the Torah over and over again speaks about the underprivileged, about the ger, the yasom, the almana, the orphans, the widows, the gerim who came from a different world, a different nation. And over again, the Torah admonishes us that we remember ki gerim hayisem be'eretz Mitzrayim. The Gemara tells us that 36 times in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah reminds us to be careful and care and reach out to the gerim, to sojourners, the lonely people who have no one to turn to, who find themselves in a community, they have no relatives, they are loners, suffering from loneliness. Reach out to them. Remember that you are gerim in Eretz Mitzrayim. It's as if the entire experience of gerus, 210 years of gerus, Redu, was for the purpose of training and raising a nation with a level of morality, of care and concern for a fellow member of the community to experience a deep sense of identification with the needy, a certain element of empathy. And we, the people of Israel, can empathize because we experienced being lowly slaves, subjugated, as loners, as gerim, the Eretz Mitzrayim. Ger Yezaracha. God promises Avram in the bris bein of his son. Ger means a lonely person who finds himself in a foreign society. Often he doesn't even know the language. Certainly has trouble eking out a financial base for himself. We have to go out. And the Jewish people in tzedakah have excelled by and large. And I would go even a step further. And I don't want to sound like, I'm putting down the goyim and we are superior and all that. But I believe statistically, the facts speak for themselves. Our unique sensitivity as a nation, Chazal say, what defines a Jew? What are the characteristics morally that are simanim, that indicate the greatness of the Jew and his uniqueness? And the Gemara identifies that they are Rachmanim and Baishanim and Gomlei Chasadim. And Gemilas Chesed is even greater than Tzedakah. Tzedakah means he has financial needs, I give him some money. But Gemilas Chesed means I understand not just his financial needs, but all of his psychological needs, his place in society, and the difficulties that he faces, and the challenges. If I can help him, that's chesed. That's even greater than tzedakah. But one of the simanim that identify the Jewish nation is rachmanim. And that's the plural of the word rachman. Let me call your attention to a grammatical nuance in Lashon Kodesh that might have missed your attention. There's a word called merachem and a word called racham. The Jewish people are not described by the Gemara in Yevamis as merachamim, but rather as rachmanim. What is the difference between a merachem and a rachman? A merachem, that word describes action. It doesn't say anything necessarily about the person himself or his essential, critical personality, but rather it says that he's merachem. You could say that a man walking down the street and he sees an ani and he goes over to give him a shekel or 10 shekels. Yeah, he's merachem. What will be tomorrow? I don't know. If again he gives tzedakah, he's again a merachem. But it's just a bunch of little dots and events on a flowchart of time, of sequence of time. That's not a rachman. A rachman is not describing an action, but a person. He is a rachman. That means that his very essence is to do rachmanis. He cannot live in a different behavior pattern. This is what he is. You would not say about the Chafetz Chaim, Zichrono Livracha, that he was a merachem. You know, I saw him have rachmanis. You know, he gave some milk to a cat. No. The Chafetz Chaim was a rachman. That's the only thing he knew. That was the essence of his personality. When a fire broke out over 100 years ago in the city of Brisk, it's probably about 130 years ago, and my grandfather, Reb Chaim, his house was one of the few houses in Brisk that stood and somehow miraculously was not burnt down. Reb Chaim opened up his doors, he and his Rebbitzin. And they say about Reb Chaim that he didn't even sleep in his own bed. That's a merachem. That's a rachama, not just a merachem. So that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us in every single midah and every moral attribute to identify with goodness, with a midah tova, and have it define our very essence. Not just here, there, hopshot, and on occasions describing the actions. Here, at the beginning of our parsha, the Torah warns the judges. You are personifications of truth. Midvar sheker tircha. Stay far away from sheker. Lo sate mishpat. Do not side with one of the two litigants in a head-on collision. Seek out the truth. Lo tikach shochad, but tzedek tirda. It's got to be absolute. It's got to be something that's essential to a person. And here I want to talk to you about the ultimate goal of the judges in a litigation and the concept of shalom. Initially, the Gemara tells us when the two Balei Dinim, the plaintiff and the defendant, come into court, you beinecha kirishayim, you know that one of them is trying to falsify and fabricate the truth, and he's trying to steal money from his friend. But in your mind, you have no nitiyah, you don't incline towards him or towards Reuven or Shimon. Let's assume that both are suspect. But the goal is that when they leave, after they accepted your ruling, they are tzaddikim. And that's shalom. What is the relationship between emes, which defines the essence of judgment, and which the Torah commands us over and over again to seek out the truth, and that's what the judges have to do. They are totally focused on truth and shalom. Very often, there is a conflict between emes and shalom. And what that means is that if we take emes to its extreme, we can undermine shalom. The Gemara talks about this in Masechta Ksubis, in the famous sugya of Keitad Meragdim Kala. And the Gemara says that Beit Shammai were very nervous about dancing in front of the Kala with words of praise to the sky when maybe she doesn't really reflect that. This is not emes. This is a violation of sheker. But Beis Hillel said that emes has to kowtow to shalom, to peace. As great of an attribute that emes is, nevertheless, there's something even greater than emes, and that's shalom. And the Gemara tells us, Meshanim Ibnei Shalom, which we derive from Yosef and his brothers, that sometimes it's necessary to bend the truth for the sake of peace, of shalom. But ultimately, Oseh Shalom B'Mromah, God makes peace up on high. In a real sense, when two litigants appear in front of the judges for a decision, and the judges are guided by the desire for emes, it's very difficult, near impossible, to expect shalom. And so, the Gemara tells us in Masechta Sanhedrin, Daf Vav, that the halacha advocates in favor of compromise. How do we understand compromise? In contemporary life, we call it arbitration. Isn't that sheker? The Torah finds lying abominable. Midvar sheker tircha. And yet, we're going to create a compromise so that instead of Reuven owing Shimon 1,000, he'll pay him 500, or will allow Shimon to collect 500 when Reuven says, I don't owe you a dime. How do we understand compromise? My feeling is that to understand compromise, we have to go back to basic philosophical concepts. There's something called thesis, and then there's antithesis. Everything in this world, and especially in human interactions, is made up of both thesis and antithesis. There is no pure 100% truth. There's always a conflict between two elements. And it's elu v'elu divrei chayim. There is a truth that is an integration of thesis and antithesis. And if we apply that to the case of judgment, then no one is 100% right. There's always an element of truth in each one of the two litigants on both sides. The concept of Jewish litigation culminating in shalom at the expense of emes, which means compromise, pshara, and not emes, is the Jewish reconciliation of thesis and antithesis, which could lead to shalom. And in that case, we are imitating God on high. We are emulating Oseh Shalom B'Mromah. All the aspects of the heavenly courts of Malachei Hasharetz are full of contradictions. There's Michael, And there's a Gavriel, there's Midas Hadin, and Midas Harachamim. Midas Hadin comes in front of the Ribbon Shalom, Kisei HaKavod, claiming that the Jews are guilty, and they should be condemned as accused. And Midas Harachamim says, no, there were extenuating circumstances, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And only Hashem is Osa Shalom. But in a human court, what is the best that we can hope for? Can human beings really know where the truth lies? In fact, I would submit to you that that litigant who is to be found chayav and not zakai, the one who's guilty, he can present the case as if he's the most honest person and convince everyone that he's in the right. I don't know how Dayanim could possibly expect to judge and decide he's telling the truth, he's lying, the law is with him, and he's got to pay him. It's beyond human capacity. But Jewish mishpat, Shoftim titen lecha, is Laman Tichya. What does it mean, Laman Tichya? We go back to creation. The Gemara tells us that when three judges sit in a court and they focus totally on emes and losata mishma, then Hashem nitzav badas kel, pasuk in David HaMelech, God is there to preside over the case. And if we can emulate Oseh Shalom b'mroma, and if lechatchila we can ideally reach a compromise, then that is our human effort to emulate the Almighty. And by doing so, we bring down the Shekhinah. Hashem nitzav badas kel. And it is a tremendous siyata d'shmaya, the help from God, that the Dayanim could finally reveal the truth. But as we said before, the truth itself is an integration of his truth and his truth, of Elu v'Elu, of Oseh Shalom b'mroma, of finding that paradoxical integration of both thesis and antithesis. And that's the dimension of Jewish judges that makes us very, very unique. I would like to fast forward for a moment to a pasuk that's later on here in Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Dvarim, pasuk Yud. The Torah speaks about the judges and the leaders of Israel, and this entire section culminates with the Asis al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha. You shall observe the word as they tell you, as they instruct you. And we're not talking about Nevi'im here. The Torah is authorizing human judges who sit on a court, not prophets. And the Torah is commanding us, do in accordance with the way they instruct you. And my friends, this reveals something very fundamental about Judaism, and that's called Mesorah. When the Torah says, "V'asisa al pi hadavar asher yorucha, asher yagidu lecha, v'shamarta lasos kechol asher yorucha," the Torah is speaking about the Mesorah, the transmission of Torah from generations to generation. When a particular rabbi in a particular time period presents a ruling and a decision in a halachic issue, that is not a one-time occurrence. That's part of Masorah, all the insights and all the chidushim of Chachmei Yisrael, of the great sages of Israel, form one golden continuous chain of a Masorah that would be passed from generation to generation. Why is it that we read Tshuvas, and there are experts in reading responsive literature that goes back centuries? Why? Who cares about a Shiloh that was brought in front of the Marik 500 years ago, 600 years ago? And for that matter, in front of Rav Moshe Feinstein or Rav Avad Yosef 50 years ago. Why is it relevant to me today? Because Psak Halacha defines the essence of the Masorah of Klal Yisrael, the Masorah of Torah, the insights of a posek when he rules on a case are part and parcel, integrated into the very fabric of Torah itself. And therefore, v'yasisa al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha u'shmartem shmarta la'asos k'chol asher yerucha. This is a HaRav that is handed down by the Chachmei Masorah and transmitted from one generation to the other. And the Torah says that we don't listen to prophets when it comes to Jewish law. And lo b'shamayim, the prophets who may say, well, God told me that the halacha is like this one or like that one, we don't pay any attention to that. The prophets have no status because they are not part of the Chachmei Masorah. There were many Nevi'im that were part of the Chachmei Masorah. But that's not what Nevuah is all about. And therefore, we have in these psukim a tremendous emphasis on what we call midivrei sofrim, which are rabbinic enactments that come under the pasuk v'asisa al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha. For those of you who have studied Masechtas Shabbos, you know that the largest proportion and chunk of Masechtas Shabbos is about shvusim, which are rabbinic enactments. Because when the Chachmei Masorah enact a shvus, it becomes an essential part of Torah. And I'll prove it to you. There are halachas midivrei sofrim that are in Tanakh. A great example would be Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther is chock full of halachic rulings that were initiated and instituted by the Anshe Knesset Gdola, and there are other parts of Tanakh that have halachic rulings that are midivrei sofrim. We have an entire tractate in the Talmud called Masechta Megillah. There's nothing in Masechta Megillah that's d'oraisa. It's all d'rabbanan. There's so many mitzvos of Purim, all d'rabbanan. So I ask you the following question. I have two Masechtas on my table. I have Masechta Shabbos. Let me leave out Shabbos. I have Masechta Sukkah, for example. 90% of Masechta Sukkah deals with d'oraisas, with the mitzvah of Sukkah, Lulav, Esrog, the Dalminim, Nisach HaMayim, which is probably d'oraisa, etc., etc. I have another Masechta on my table, Masechta Megillah, that is purely d'rabbanan. And I'm obligated to learn Torah because the Torah commands me, V'shinantam levanecha, the great mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Which of these two Masechtas should I choose? I don't hear any answers because all I see is names that are written on a screen. I don't know if there's anyone behind those names. I can't know. So I'm going to have to answer the question myself. I have no choice. I will learn Masechta Megillah. There's nothing pushing me to choose and prefer. Oh, I see
I
Chaim.
think in theory, I would say probably the Mesuka Sukkah, but in practice, I would say Megillah.
And the reason why you choose Megillah is not because of theory, not because of practice, but because of theory. Because once the Rabbanon instituted and ruled that we have to read the Megillah on Purim and we have Mishloach Manos and Matanos Avyonim and Sudas Purim, etc., those laws become part of the fabric of Torah. They are a Chefza Shel Torah no less than Sukkah and Lulav and Schach and the Daled Minim. It's all a Chefza Shel Torah. And that's written here in this pasuk. The oral law, which includes decisions, interpretations, enactments, and siyagim of the Chachmei HaMesorah, that is part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And it has no less of a status than any other part of Torah. And if someone will tell you, well, I will learn Sukkah instead of Megillah because Megillah is all D'Rabbanan, then he should be rejected. Such an approach is antithetical to the very essence of what it means to have a Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh is made up not just of Aloch L'Moshe Misinai's. Torah Sheba'al Peh is made up of the ongoing tradition of the Chachmei HaMesorah, their insights, their enactments throughout all of Jewish history. And therefore, when Shlomo HaMelech instituted Netilas Yadayim, or Erev Chatzeros, as the Gemara records in the Masechta Shabbos Daf Yud Daled, and those institutions now became part of Divrei Kabbalah, these mitzvos have been integrated in Tanakh and have the same status as the words of the prophets in Nevi'im and Ksuvim. It's not part of the written Torah, but it's part of the oral Torah, the Mesorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And finally, to conclude our discussion for tonight, I'd like you to fast forward to the Parsha of Melech, the mitzvah of appointing a king, which you'll see here in Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Tesvav. Som tasim alecha melech, you will appoint for yourself a king. Now, the Torah gives us some background to this concept of appointing a king. And the Torah says that in Pasuk Yud Daled, Ki tavoy la'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha nosein lach v'yirishta v'yashavta ba v'amarta hasima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher svivosai. And reading the English translation, when you come to the land, etc., and you will say, I will set a king over myself, like all the nations around me. And I have to ask you, Chaim, if you don't mind, you have to, mute your, oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. So a Jewish king is appointed upon the request of Israel, of the people of Klal Yisrael. In a sense, it's a very democratic idea. The Torah does not thrust upon the people of Israel against their will a king. It's not a coup d'etat, as we call it, but rather the people of Israel come forward from their own initiative, and their popular will, and it could be that expressed by the Sanhedrin itself, by a Navi, they want to appoint a king. And yet, Even a superfluous reading of Sefer Shmuel will lead the reader to the correct conclusion that Shmuel was very upset and very inhibited about the request of the people to appoint a king, to the extent to which he lashes out against the people. Why? There are two preconditions for the mitzvah of appointing a king. Number one, dangers, external, possibly even internal dangers. And the king was there to protect the people against these kinds of dangers. Number two, the second condition, is the request of the people. Why was the Navi, Shmuel, so displeased when the people came forward and both conditions were met? Number one, it was a request initiated by the people to appoint a king. And number two, the king would protect the people against their external enemies. The Rambam says in Hilchas Malachim, the people made one grave mistake. And that is, they did not wait and postpone their request until after the death of Shmuel. By asking for a king during the period of Shmuel's life, they were indicating that they did not find Shmuel the appropriate moral leader. They wanted to rid themselves, so to speak, of the influence and the very high moral standards that the Navi, that Shmuel was demanding of them. Had they waited until after Shmuel's death, their request would have been appropriate and timely. But apparently, and this is what Shmuel felt intuitively in his very essence, the people were requesting a king out of a sense of rebelliousness, not for the reasons that we mentioned before, which are practical reasons, and the importance of a king. Som tasim alecha melech. The Torah is not so excited about investing absolute authority in one human being, to give the power of one human being to reign and to rule over other human beings. That is not a great virtue. God himself is the creator, and he's capable of ruling. He knows all. He's omniscient. And according to one opinion in the Gemara Sanhedrin, Rav Norai says that our apostle of V'amarta asim alai melech is just an anticipation of what the Jewish people will be tempted to do down the line. And the Rishonim say that this mitzvah of Som Tasim Alecha, Ibn Ezra says it, the Ramban repeats it, this is a concession to human weakness. The Torah will tolerate the situation of placing a king over other Jews, to rule over them. That's something the Torah would barely tolerate. But there is no absolute chova, an independent mandatory obligation to appoint a king is not in the Torah. The Torah is talking about a case where out of human weakness, we'll make a concession and will allow for the appointment of a king. And basically what Rav Noroi is telling us is that the Torah is already anticipating down the line this kind of a rebellious attitude. We need a king. And look at the language. We are really imitating the Goyim. And we know from the history of man, and it repeats itself over and over again, that power corrupts. And even if a king or a political leader in his initial stages had the right intention for the good of his people, he was compassionate. But yet, over the course of time, he wants the people to acclaim him. He enjoys the publicity, the public nature, and he succumbs to those desires to achieve mass popular acclaim. And as a result, very often, he becomes a cruel individual, spending monies, expenditures in a way that just reflects his insatiable desire, his craving for being accepted by the masses. And if he's granted unlimited authority, we are in a dangerous, precarious situation. And Shmuel at the end tells Shaul that, you know what, you transgressed God's command. And of course, Shmuel came up with a very flimsy excuse to try to defend himself. And basically what he said was he wanted to satisfy the people who didn't want to destroy Amalek. And not only that, they had a lust for spoils, and they wanted to take the animals and so forth and so on. And basically what Shmuel said to Shaul is that you're not a leader, you're a follower. And therefore God takes the Malchus away from Shaul, the very first king of Israel, who is meant to be so effective as a leader. And yet, the life of Shaul proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that a human being will ultimately succumb to those pressures. And therefore the Torah is very reluctant to appoint a king. It's only, as we said before, in the name of the Rishonim, a concession to the desire of the king. I want to end the shir with a tefillah for Chodesh Elul, that some of these ideals that we spoke about tonight of truth, of peace, of building the structure and the essence of Klal Yisrael as Rachmanim, as those whose very essence is to be compassionate. And we should praise and admire those who seek to break out of the confines of slavery, of profanity, and strive to reach higher goals of spirituality, of sanctity, of Kedushas Yisrael. We should reach out to those individuals whose sensitive souls are seeking Kedusha, are longing for Kedusha. Very often they're lonely members of Klal Yisrael. But yes, the mitzvah of tzedakah is essentially the mitzvah of tzedek, of justice, from a Jewish perspective. He wrote on that we could all, during this Chodesh Elul, commit ourselves to judge ourselves, because the mitzvah of Shoftim Titein Lecha is primarily a person should judge himself, and judge himself by comparing himself to this axiological scale in which he can raise himself and inspire himself to fix up all those evils and all those pitfalls and barriers that the evil inclination puts in front of us, so that he can reach higher levels of being a Rahman, of Tzedek, of Emes and Shalom. And with this mitzvah of Tzedek Tirdov, to bring the Shekhinah down, Hashem Nitza Badas Kel, and will be Zochem Yirtz Hashem on this Rosh Hashanah, to be written in the books of Chaim for peace, for happiness, for spiritual levels of elevation, together with those tzaddikim who are written in the Sifrei Tzaddikim, Ken Yiratzon, Omne. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.
Toda Rabba. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi Berzon.
Thank you much. Thank you so much.